Obviously, I'm just presenting my own perspective and my own views. There are many views in this room on the topic of religion. I think there's people here from many different religious backgrounds. So feel free to speak up and talk on this topic. But as we talk about getting out of the movement into the masses, and as we talk about opposing the synthetic left, and as we talk about socialism in America, we obviously have to be able to talk about the issue of religious faith, and there's no way to not talk about it. So I'm going to speak on a few things. The first thing I was going to do is I was going to read a quote from Frederick Nietzsche. This is from Frederick Nietzsche. He said, "Let us not underestimate the destiny that has crept all the way from Christianity into politics. Today, nobody has any longer the courage of special rights or the right of command or a sense of respect toward oneself and one's peers, a pathos of distance. Our politics are sick through this absence of courage. The fib of equality of souls undermine the aristocratic outlook in the most insidious way. And while our faith in the prerogative of the most is making and will make revolutions, it is Christianity, let there be no mistake about it, and it is Christian judgments that turn every revolution into mere crime and bloodshed. Christianity is the revolt of all groveling creatures against that which has stature. It is the gospel of the lowly, and it makes for lowliness."
Nietzsche.
That's Frederick Nietzsche.
What a guy.
And what he's saying is he argues that communism is rooted in Christianity, and he sees that as a negative thing. Now, that quote is highlighted in a book called The Destruction of Reason by Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist. What? Georgy Lukács, there you go. And in that book, he's talking about the roots of what he terms philosophical irrationalism, which is coming out of the Enlightenment, with the rise of capitalism. You had a whole new school of thought. So, we talk about Spanish colonialism, right? The first colonizer of the Americas was Spain. And Spain, at the time, 1492, we all learned about Columbus sails the ocean blue. At that time, Spain was a stronghold of feudalism, whereas in the rest of Europe, you had the Protestant Reformation breaking out, and you had people beginning to challenge the Catholic order. In Spain, which was a stronghold of the Catholic Church, they had the Spanish Inquisition, like a crackdown on any elements that might bring forth some kind of reformation in Spain. And as Spain was becoming a colonizer, going into what we now consider Latin America, you had priests coming into South and Central America, setting up missionaries. You had indigenous people being forcibly converted to Christianity. But Spain had a little bit of a problem, which was that many within the Catholic hierarchy felt morally conflicted about what was going on, and were not comfortable with the fact that while the colonization was being done in the name of spreading the religion and converting these indigenous people and saving their souls, it was very clear that on the part of Christopher Columbus and Fernando Cortez and others, there was clearly a selfish motivation. The idea was to come to the lands of the Americas, plunder the loot, enslave the people, and make lots of money. And you see many instances of priests from the Catholic missions speaking up and saying, this isn't right. You can't forcibly convert people. That's not real conversion if they do it on the threat of being killed or persecuted. And on top of that, we shouldn't be going to these lands simply motivated by a desire to plunder them and pretend that this is some kind of Christian mission. And that Spain, because it remained a feudal society, its ability to be a colonizer was somewhat restricted, and that it had a problem in doing so. But as we saw the rise of British imperialism, things were a bit different. And there was suddenly talk of selfishness and the Protestant work ethic, and the British were able to get ahead as colonizers because they weren't restricted by the moral codes and the rules and the judgments that contain feudal society. Feudal society is a very, very controlled society. In feudalism, you don't have much freedom at all, right? A peasant can't look a landowner in the face. There's different words people use, different hierarchies. The death penalty is used very, very liberally. One cannot challenge or question any of the religious doctrines, or one's burned at the stake. Feudalism is a very, very controlled society. And the French Revolution was an explosion against feudalism. And it was largely a society that had been very restricted and restrained, breaking out into a big explosion of sexual freedom, of revenge against the old nobles and the hierarchies, and it was very atheistic. You know, the French Revolution converted the churches of France as temples of reason. And it's interesting because out of the French Revolution, we get the notion of the left and the right. Right? The people on the right were the ones who were still loyal to the king when they first formed the National Assembly. The people on the left were those who kind of fully embraced the revolution, the Jacobins and others. And that's where the left and the right. And the left was associated with this explosive energy, giving people freedom to unleash their impulses, freedom to tear down old institutions, freedom to question beliefs, freedom to stand up against authority. And we know that the French Revolution soon degenerated into the reign of terror and the mass executions that were going on. We see those crowds cheering as people are getting their heads cut off. And that the French Revolution was also an explosion of sexuality. The Marquis de Sade was a key figure in agitating for the French Revolution. This aristocrat who had been put in mental hospitals and had committed horrendous crimes against women, who wrote these very pornographic stories, all making the point that morality doesn't exist, truth doesn't exist. I mean, if you read Justine, if you read any of his writing, it starts out he's rambling about philosophy, and then it turns into a very violent pornographic story about some woman being brutalized, usually by a priest or a high-ranking government official or someone who's supposed to be noble, all while the man is brutalizing the woman and lecturing her that morality doesn't exist. It's actually the law of the jungle, might makes right. This was kind of the ideology of the French Revolution. And as the reign of terror continued, and as the population grew weary of all this terror and bloodshed and releasing of anger and rage, the Marquis de Sade is worried that the French revolutionary energy is dying down. He actually urges that in order to keep the revolutionary energy going, they should set up theaters where there's naked women on display, so men can walk in and see the naked women, and their sexual passion will be aroused, and they will continue the energy of the revolution. The French Revolution is that explosion, and then we know that after 10 great years that we had the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon comes back into power and kind of compromises with the church and compromises with the old system, and the French Revolution is kind of calmed down. But the French Revolution, along with the bourgeois revolutions of Britain and the bourgeois revolution, the American Revolution of 1776, gives birth to the capitalist order, where we're no longer are we recognizing kings with divine right granted by God to rule over us. Instead, we are recognizing the triumph of reason and the equality of man and the rights of all, etc. This new order is coming into existence. And as capitalism emerges as the new order, colonialism, and eventually what gives rise to the modern order of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, becomes dominant in the world. And Frederick Nietzsche represents a current that celebrated the fact that it seemed like with the dawn of imperialism, Western man was shedding any moral or religious pretenses. Frederick Nietzsche writes about the blonde beast. Imperialism is enabling the Western man to no longer be restricted by morality, no longer be restricted by compassion for others, but instead man, the Western man, the blonde beast, can now rule over people around the world in the most ruthless and cruel ways. And we read about the horrendous atrocities that were committed, in Africa during the period of colonialism and in Asia and many places. A lot of them justified, we talk about the eugenic, racial pseudoscience and all these atrocities. And Frederick Nietzsche, unlike others who might defend capitalism by saying that, capitalism, it's unfair, but communism and socialism, it doesn't work, it's not a real alternative. Nietzsche is celebrating the cruelty of capitalism, celebrating the injustice and saying that some people are just naturally better than others. And that the lie of Christianity is that Christianity views people as equal, it urges people to love their neighbor as their self, to be compassionate, to be kind, and that is subverting the natural hierarchies that exist. That's what Frederick Nietzsche is arguing. And this is the beginning of what they call philosophical irrationalism. Why is it called philosophical irrationalism? Because the basis of it is there's an argument about, is the nature of the universe order or chaos? That's the question. Those who believe the nature of the universe is ordered are rational, and those who believe the nature of the universe is chaos are irrational. And Frederick Nietzsche and others, the philosophical irrationalists, argued that the world was chaotic, that there was no real order. And they argued that any attempt to bring order to the world would threaten things, was somehow tyrannical. If you tried to argue that there was order in the world, if you tried to make a system that explained the way the world worked, you would ruin everything. And we should just celebrate the chaos of the world around us. That's philosophical irrationalism. And that is really the religion that dominates the United States among the elite at this time. Whether it's Ayn Rand, Leo Strauss, philosophical irrationalism is what our elite believe. They believe there is no real right and wrong. They believe that if you're strong enough, you can make your own moral code. They believe compassion and kindness is for suckers. It's a weakness. That's what they believe. And that belief system is largely tearing apart our society. If you look at it, it's one thing for the elite to think this way because they've probably always felt that way. But it's another thing for these ideas to filter down into the population at large. When these ideas start to filter down into society, suddenly nothing works. You need an army, people to go out and be able to give their life for their country, for their nation, for the cause. You need them to go out and die for it. But if you're telling people, don't be a sucker, don't make sacrifices, live only for yourself, selfishness is the highest virtue, they're not going to go out and die for you. Right? If you tell people, you look all throughout our society, people feel no loyalty to anyone else. People feel no loyalty to anyone. And postmodernism that's pushed really hard on the campuses. There's this whole thing about, Jordan Peterson talks about postmodern neo-Marxists. Well, postmodernism is the belief that there is no ideology, that ideology itself is a problem. And Marxism is an ideology. So you can't be a postmodern neo-Marxist, right? Postmodernism is a movement draws from Marxism only because Marxism is a vehicle for deconstruction. Marxism takes apart certain things. For example, right? The family, right? The family has been different in different societies, right? In primitive communism, the family was one way. In slavery and feudalism, the family was another way. In modern capitalism, it's another way. Marxism says there's not some eternal sacred way the family is. The family is different under different economic circumstances, the base and the superstructure. As the economic base of society changes, the superstructure changes. The nature of the government. There's no eternal way a government should be. There's, the government under feudalism was one way. The government under capitalism is another way. The government under socialism. So Marxism is very good at taking apart. And so that's useful to the postmodernists because they want to take things apart, but they reject all truth. They reject all ideology. They reject all belief systems, and they only see good in deconstruction. As long as you're taking things apart, you're doing well. But when you start building, and you start creating, and you start constructing, that leads to tyranny, that leads to oppression of the individual, that leads to the menace of collectivism. This is the postmodernist worldview. That's what they believe. And the reason that this belief in postmodernism is tearing apart Western civilization is because human beings need ideology. Ideology, I've used the analogy many times, is like you're driving down the road. When you're driving down the road, you know where you came from, you know where you're going, you know how you're getting there, and so you can drive down the road. But I've said, imagine you were driving down the road and you had a Joe Biden moment, and you suddenly wondered, where am I going? Where did I come from? How do I get there? If you did that, you would stop the car immediately. If you didn't know where you were going, you didn't know where you came from, you would stop the car. And that's what's happening all across the United States and all across the Western world. People are stopping the car. They don't know where they're going because they've been told that every roadmap they've been given is a lie. The government and the media is not giving them a roadmap by which to live. They have no ideology. And because of that, they're stopping the car. There's no reason to wake up in the morning. There's no reason to believe in something. There's no reason to look to the future with any hope or optimism. They're stopping the car. So ideology is very important. So I want to talk about the ideology of Christianity and the ideology of communism. Just want to make some observations here. So Christianity, I think many of us grew up with religious faith. Christianity, it says that we began in the Garden of Eden. Right? We had the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve lived there. They had everything they needed. Everything was provided for them. It was a paradise, and they were told by God, there's one tree you must not touch, and if you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. But, the snake convinced Eve to eat of the fruit. And so, out of the Garden of Eden, we have the fall of man. And what is the fall of man? Well, Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. And after they're cast out of the garden, what happens next? God says, "And in the sweat of thy face that shalt thou eat bread, until thou return unto the ground. For it is out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." So when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, they suddenly have to start working the land and growing their own food. They have to live by the sweat of their brow. So after the fall of man, we have all kinds of turmoil. And that's the Old Testament of the Bible. It tells us all kinds of turmoil. Moses and Noah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the prophets. We have all kinds of turmoil that exists as the children of Israel are going from land to land and being oppressed, and prophets are coming down to them, and etc. All of this turmoil leads to the Messiah. The Messiah returning. Jesus. So Jesus comes. All this turmoil leads up to the arrival of the Messiah. And with the Messiah, we have the birth of the church of Christianity. And then the understanding is, I guess, the birth of the church. And then the understanding is that eventually, as a result of the church and as the result of the battle between good and evil, this will all lead to the second coming and Eden restored. So that's the Christian narrative. We get from Eden to Eden. We get from Eden to the fall of man, to the turmoil that leads to the coming of the Messiah and the creation of the church, and the church eventually leads to a gigantic battle with the forces of evil that then leads to the second coming and Eden restored, heaven on earth. That is the Christian narrative, as I understand it. So what does communism teach us? Okay, so communism teaches us that first we had primitive communism, hunter-gatherer civilization. People were hunting and gathering, they lived in tribes, they didn't grow their own food, they didn't domesticate any animals. But at some point, we got too good at it. We started hunting and gathering so well that there was a scarcity. So it got to the point that you had the origin of class society. And if you read The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State by Frederick Engels, it talks about how it was with the dawn of agriculture that you have the dawn of the patriarchy and the family, you have the dawn of the state. So you have the creation out of primitive communism, you have the origin of class society. Class society comes out of primitive communism with the origin of private property. I guess that should probably be two stages, right? I guess first we'll have origin of property, and that leads to class society. Class society all leads toward the creation of the proletariat. The final class of history, the proletariat. And then the understanding is, with the emergence of the proletariat struggles against the bourgeoisie as the final class of history. All other previous movements have been movements of minorities, Marx tells us, but the proletarian movement is the movement of the immense majority on behalf of the immense majority of society. And the struggle of the proletariat leads to higher communism. Now, I think it's interesting to look at the overlap in these narratives. It's a very similar narrative of human history and its civilization. If you talk about a roadmap of where are we going, you can see a pretty similar thing. From Eden to Eden restored, from primitive communism to higher communism, it's a very, very similar narrative. I think that's worth observing, and it's worth noting that. When we talk about Christianity, we talk about the coming of the Messiah. Many people have debated, and there's a huge amount of argument about the historicity of Jesus, right? You know, some people will maintain Jesus never existed. Karl Kautsky, who wrote The Foundations of Christianity, he argued that Jesus was a composite figure of many different messiahs or figures who had risen up among the Jewish people to fight the Roman Empire. There's a lot of different arguments about it. But the understanding is that there was some kind of leader in Palestine who was fighting the Roman Empire, who was considered to be such an enemy of the Roman Empire that he had to be crucified. Crucifixion was considered the ultimate punishment, only reserved for the greatest enemies of the Roman state. That he was put to death for his crimes against the Roman Empire, but after his death, people continued to worship him. The Roman Empire considered it to be a threat to them, but it spread, and as Rome was declining, Christianity was in ascendancy. That's what we understand to be historically true, that Christianity was rising as Rome was falling. And in fact, the City of God, which is one of the key texts of Christian theology, is written from a defensive perspective. St. Augustine is writing the text because the Roman Empire, the biggest empire that dominated the modern world, it fell almost simultaneously as it adopted Christianity as its religion. And that was a big problem for Christians because they're going around the world trying to convince people to adopt their religion, and people are saying, wait a second, the biggest empire in the world just collapsed when it adopted your religion. That's not a good selling point. So St. Augustine writes the City of God, arguing there's the city of man and the city of God, and basically saying that Christianity wasn't designed to save the Roman Empire. We're not arguing that if you adopt our religion, you know, it'll make your empire mighty. And he's writing from a defensive perspective. And that's a key point. And that the Roman Empire, now we'll talk about the proletariat, because it's in Rome that you first have the proletariat. The origin of the word proletariat, it's Latin, it's rooted in Latin, it's the word for having children. A proletarian is one who has children. And the reason that they referred to this group of people in Rome as those who have children is because they didn't have any slaves and they didn't have any land, but they weren't owned by anyone else. They weren't slaves themselves. So they were men of no property. That's one translation. Men of no property, or those who own nothing but their offspring, those who own nothing but their children, the proletarians. They were a class of people in Rome. Overwhelmingly, they were Jews from Palestine and they were Greeks. And they came to Rome because they had some kind of skill, because they could work as a wage laborer. The Romans had plenty of slaves to do manual labor, but they didn't have pipe fitters. They didn't have blacksmiths. They didn't have carpenters. They didn't have people who could do pipes, people who could do specific skills. And proletarians, they would come to Rome and they would get paid a wage. They would rent where they lived from a landowner, and they would live in Rome. And Rome was the capital of the modern world at that time. It was the center of this mighty empire. But you read about Cleopatra and you read about some of these kings who would visit Rome, and they'd be horrified to see homeless people on the street. And they'd say, how can this be possible? This is the capital of the modern world. It has so much wealth and power. How can there be homeless people on the street? Well, there's homeless people on the street because when you have proletarians, those proletarians are sometimes unemployed. And when they're unemployed, they can't pay their rent. And when they can't pay their rent, they get thrown out on the street. And in fact, in Rome, you had a big problem of homeless children were a menace to Roman society. It's written about, people would be walking around and there'd be these mobs of homeless children that would rob them and steal from them. And the Roman Empire is constantly dealing with all these homeless children they had in Rome. Another aspect of Rome, infanticide. The Roman Empire, foundational to their establishment was the practice of killing babies right after they're born. In Rome, they had a ceremony. Every household, they would have a ceremony when a baby was born, either to a slave or to a woman that was married to the men of the house. And there would be a ceremony where the baby was presented to the owner of the house, to the man who owned the house, the patriarch, and he would inspect the baby. And if the baby was up to his standards, they would keep it, and if not, they would throw it in the river. And this was everyday practice. And in fact, it was punishable by death in Rome not to practice infanticide. If you gave birth to a child that was disabled or disfigured in any way, and you didn't throw them in the river, you could be executed. And this was some kind of demented eugenics that the Roman Empire practiced, and it was horrifying. And what's interesting is so many of the stories and legends from ancient times talk of babies that are thrown out in this horrible way, who somehow survive and go on to do amazing things. The founding myth of the Roman Empire is Romulus and Remus, two brothers who their father leaves them to die by the river, and they are raised by wolves, and because they're raised by wolves, they become tough and mighty, and they establish the Roman Empire. And, the story of Moses, right? Again, another baby that's just cast aside, that goes on to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt, right? And that all throughout the ancient world, you see many myths and stories and legends and that are telling of babies that were cast aside who go on to do great things, because it's the human psyche trying to deal with the trauma of this horrendous practice, Can you imagine taking a baby that's just been born from a mother and throwing it away? Can you imagine the horror that people felt at seeing this in their everyday life? It's just a heartlessness. And so Rome is this empire founded on might makes right, where they start doing, the gladiatorial shows. You read about the Colosseum. They're trying to desensitize the population, get the population to be desensitized to war and killing in order to psych the population up for the wars. This is an empire that's going around the world plundering nations at the point of a spear, and it's declining economically because slavery is a highly inefficient system. Slaves have no real motivation to work, right? A slave, he can't get ahead in the world. He can't gain anything. And when you have 10 slaves in a household, they might gain as the whole household kind of gains, and so they might have some motivation. But if you have a plantation and there's hundreds of slaves on it, they don't gain anything. And on top of that, you have to have somebody on top of all the slaves to make them keep working. If you got 100 slaves, that's very difficult. But if you get 1,000 slaves, it's even more difficult. And that the bigger slavery gets, the bigger the Roman mines and plantations got, the bigger the caches of people that they brought in from different parts of the empire got, the more inefficient the empire became. And their ability to produce their own crops was constantly decreasing. And their ability to produce their own metal tools was constantly decreasing. And as the Roman Empire got bigger, its ability to become effective and to produce goods was constantly going down. And as Rome was declining, you saw a battle among Romans, an argument between two trends that existed. And those trends were the hedonists and the Stoics. And the hedonists were kind of embracing the ideology of the Roman Empire that said pleasure is the highest good. The cult of Dionysus, I think it was Bacchus, right, that they worshipped and they had parties and pleasure is the highest good. And then you had the Stoics, which were people that were looking for some kind of spiritual fulfillment. And the Stoics would starve themselves, they would take hallucinogenic drugs, they tended to worship different gods that were imported. They would worship gods from Egypt or gods from Persia, and they would worship foreign religions that were brought into Rome. They would follow philosophers like Seneca, who urged them to live humble lives. Well, that was the pushback between the hedonists and the Stoics in Rome. And they were clashing with each other. Is it better to live for pleasure, or is it better to suffer and somehow become pure or find some moral, fulfillment or spiritual fulfillment during suffering? That's the fighting that's going on. Christianity comes to Rome largely as the expression of the Roman proletarians. Jewish proletarians who came to Rome in order to work as carpenters or pipe fitters, they start worshiping Jesus. What's interesting is it was illegal in Rome to practice any form of monotheism, because if you believed in one God, you were denying the great gods of the Roman Empire. So it was illegal to believe in monotheism. But the man who changed that law and legalized monotheism was Julius Caesar. And the reason that Julius Caesar legalized monotheism is because he was a champion of the Jews, of the proletarians who came to Rome. And he was considered their champion, and as a favor to the proletarians who he was supporting and enacting all kinds of reforms as he battled against his own class as a Bonapartist, he changed the law and legalized monotheism, made it legal to believe in one God in Rome. And we know that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death. What's interesting is that until the killing of Julius Caesar, Rome had been a republic. It had had an elected National Assembly, and it had a hereditary Senate, and it was the Roman Republic. But the stabbing of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC, that marked the end of the Roman Republic. And after the Roman Republic, they then, from then on, had a monarch, an emperor. And the emperor, the Romans proclaimed, was a god on earth. He was a man-god. But also, after they established the monarchy, in addition to having their living emperor, they built a temple to Julius Caesar. And at that temple, they argued that Julius Caesar, after being stabbed to death, had become a god. After dying and being killed, he'd become a god. And they began practicing and worshiping Julius Caesar as a deity. And some of the images of Julius Caesar, he has an interesting crown on his head, a wreath of laurels on his head. And this man who'd been seen as a champion of the proletarians, he has a wreath of laurels on his head. He died for the people, and they are worshiping him. He's now ascended into heaven, and he's the champion of the people. It's very interesting to look at how these things develop. But the important thing to remember about all of this is that there's a real parallel in what happened to Christianity in ancient Rome and what's happening to communism today. Which is that in ancient Rome, these Christians, they existed, and they worshipped Jesus Christ, who'd been killed by the Roman Empire. And because they worshipped Jesus Christ, a man who'd been killed by the Roman Empire, the Romans declared their religion to be seditious. You're worshiping someone who waged a rebellion against us, someone who was killed. It was not legal to practice this religion. Christians were killed, they were persecuted, they were burned, they were fed to lions, etc. But they continued believing. And in fact, much of what's written in the New Testament talks about how important it is to be willing to die for the belief. He talks about how those who die for me, those who give their life for me are the most holy. He says, whoever gains his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall gain it. And whoever denies me before others, I shall deny before my Father in heaven. Saying that basically the Christians were taught that it was their moral duty to preach the faith and continue believing, even if that meant being put to death and killed. And of course, this scared the Romans, because this was against everything the Romans had taught. People were supposed to be selfish. People were supposed to, be able to just, conform and do what they were told. These Christians are coming along. They'd say, are you a Christian? Yep, kill him. Are you a Christian? Yep, kill him. And they had the bravery to keep going. Where did this come from? We've seen this fish, right? The Ichthus, right? Which became a symbol of Christianity. It was actually a secret code that in Rome, if you wanted to approach somebody and find out if they were a Christian, you saw the sand, you would draw that in the sand. And if somebody else was a Christian and they wanted to show you that they were a Christian, they would draw that, and that would be like their confirmation that you were a Christian. It was a secret code among Christians as they were being persecuted. And this movement of Christians proliferated, and the Romans couldn't wipe it out. And for year after year, they continued to try and wipe out this religion they considered seditious and dangerous. They couldn't wipe it out. And the Christians felt an obligation to care for people. Right? Their religion said you must be kind. And they also preached that a day would come where Jesus, the Messiah, who'd been killed, would return. The second coming would come, and he would strike down the Roman Empire and destroy the empire, and that they were waiting for the day that Jesus returned. And the proletarians would organize and go on strike against the bosses to demand a higher wage. And the proletarians that were organizing were often organized by the early illegal Christian church in doing so. And they also built orphanages for the homeless children, and they fed hungry people. And they also campaigned against infanticide. And they said infanticide is an immoral practice. It's evil. We can't be doing this. And within the Roman elite, there started to be a division. After Christianity had been around for so long and they hadn't been able to exterminate it, there started to be a question of, should we wipe out Christianity? Or are there aspects of Christianity that we can use to strengthen our empire? Some of the Romans started saying, we have this problem of homeless children. These Christians build these orphanages, and if we could, give them some of our government money to do that, and we could assign these Christians, instead of organizing strikes and protests against us, to oversee these orphanages, that might be a better way of dealing with the problem. And then they said, all these areas that we go and try to conquer, in Germany and North Africa, all the people, when they rally against us, they all have their own local gods. Well, what if we made a law that there was only one God? Then all of these other gods that people rally against us with would be illegal. And you started having some among the Roman elite that started thinking that Christianity could be a useful vehicle for stabilizing the empire. And the motivation was the empire was becoming less and less stable. Their industrial output is decreasing. It's getting to the point that Rome couldn't even organize its own army. Its population was so hedonistic and selfish, they couldn't even organize their own army. And so they're trying to figure out, what can we do? And as the Roman Empire is declining, they start to get more and more friendly to Christianity, seeing Christianity as perhaps something they could use to stabilize their empire, and that all leads up to the conversion of Constantine. And Constantine, the story is he had a dream, and in the dream he saw a cross, and this booming voice said to him, "Under this sign ye shall conquer." And so that's what made him convert to Christianity. That's the legend. The funny thing is, the Roman Empire fell shortly afterwards, so whatever voice that was, it wasn't God's voice. And we all know that the real reason that Constantine converted was actually because his mother had been an underground Christian, and when he was a child had told him stories of Jesus, and that most of the Roman elite was becoming more and more interested in Christianity. But as the Roman elite were changing their aspect and their attitude toward Christianity, among the Christians, there became a divide also. Some of the Christians said we have to stay true to our revolutionary principles. We must stay true to Christianity. We want nothing to do with this evil empire. Jesus will return and he will destroy this empire. This is evil. We want nothing to do with it. But others among the Christians started to compromise with the empire and say, they're talking about legalizing us. They're going to give us some money to set up some orphanages, and maybe we can help them around the world with their colonization. And when they take over an area, we could forcibly convert the people, and then we'd have more converts. And you had some among the Roman Empire and the Roman Christians who started accommodating the Roman Empire and started watering down Christianity to adopt it to the Roman Empire and its needs. And if you read the book of Revelations, which is written, it's all kinds of language, the 4 great beasts and the 5 it seems kind of mystical. But one thing that's very clear is that text is a rant against sellout Christians, Christians that are collaborating with the empire. It talks about the great whore of Babylon and those who have drunk of her iniquity. And it rants against those who say they are Jews but are not Jews. They are the synagogue of Satan. And it's yelling about those who would betray the faith and accommodate the faith with the rich and powerful. And it's arguing that those who stay true to Christ's message, they will be the ones that are rewarded. But those who speak in the name of the faith, but in reality practice something else, in reality have sold out and accommodated with the world, they will face a harsh punishment. Whoever is writing that, the Revelation to John, whoever's writing that down is ranting against this trend in Roman Christianity of watering it down and saying, we will not water it down, we will not surrender. And we know what happened is that the Roman Empire became Christianized and the Roman Empire declined. And it's a very interesting parallel to social democracy. As the movement of the proletariat arises in Europe. The imperialists find it useful to stabilize their system. They water down socialism, and some of the socialist movement accommodates it and adopts it, accommodates with it, and some, like us, refuse to budge and stand firm in our principles. It's an interesting parallel. There's a book that's often inspired me. It was written by Thomas Carlyle. It's called On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History. And Thomas Carlyle was this Scottish intellectual, and he was trying to understand this phenomenon of heroic individuals throughout history. And so he starts out with the Norse god Odin, and then he talks about Muhammad, and he talks about different heroes throughout history, Napoleon, and what aspects make someone heroic. And one of the questions that he digs into in the chapter on Islam is he says, why is it that so many prophets destroy idols? Why do prophets destroy idols? He says, this idol, this statue that people used to worship, do we really believe that ancient humans were stupid? They could make a god in their backyard, they get a piece of wood and they just carve it up, and all right, that's God, and they pray before the statue. Were people really that dumb? No. When the idols were erected, they stood for principles. They were a symbol that people built to stand for a higher truth, and they were, involved and placed into a ritual and ceremony to commemorate this higher truth. They weren't bowing to the statue. They were bowing to the truth, to the God, to the principle that the statue was said to represent. Bowing to the statue was a symbolic act to point to and commemorate higher truths. But as the generations go on, people get into the routine, the dull routine of bowing before the statue. They get into the dull routine of bowing before the statue, and the higher truth that the statue once stood for starts to be forgotten, starts to be watered down, starts to be eroded. People are forgetting. And so the prophet comes to earth, empowered by God to go to that statue and smash the statue and destroy the statue in order to connect the people with the higher truth that they have forgotten. That is why the prophet smashes the idol, smashes the statue. It is about reconnecting humanity with the higher truth. That's what the prophet is doing. And that the statue and the idol is an impediment. It started out as something that was to remind people of the higher truth, but it turned into its opposite. It turned into something that blocks people from the higher truth. Instead of connecting with the higher God, they've got this statue, this middleman that gets in the way. So the prophet comes along to sweep away the middleman, to sweep it away in order to clear out the bad and enable the connection with that which is good. And that's why I wear one of these rings. Because when I was in Iran, I saw all the men were wearing akek rings. And then when I found out that this is because the legend is, the story, the hadith is that the Prophet Muhammad went to the temple at Mecca and he smashed all the idols, and he kept a piece of one of the idols as a commemorative trophy of destroying the idols in the temple at Mecca. But this story has relevance to the Chinese Revolution. Before you had Mao Zedong, you had Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen, his first revolutionary act in China, is he was a young man in his 20s, and he went to a village. And part of the humiliation of the peasants by the landlords was they would force the peasants not only to give their crops and to give their rent and taxes to the landowner, but to burn some of their crops as a sacrifice to statues and to engage in these kind of degrading rituals to a statue as part of their humiliation by the landlords. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen went into this temple and he saw all these peasants burning little pieces of their crops and bowing before the statues as the landlord is, smiling and getting his rent from them and subjugating them and degrading them. And the story is that Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the young man, was so full of anger that he went and he destroyed the statues. He smashed the statues. And that was the beginning of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's moment as a revolutionary, is that he destroyed the idols and statues. When falsity is everywhere, you can't just walk truth in at first. Before the truth can enter, the falsity must be destroyed. And that's why I would argue that we need to start to get away from the left as a concept. We're socialists. We're anti-imperialists. We draw heavily from Marxism. But there's no reason to be left anymore, because left comes out of the French Revolution, and left is libidinal release, and left is rage and destruction. And it was necessary, because you had to destroy that was already there. You had to destroy an institution that said you could get forgiveness for your sins by paying an indulgence. You had to destroy a system that said, well, the king rules over you with divine right. He's appointed by God. You must obey him. The left was necessary. It was necessary to have an explosion to sweep away the falsity that was there. But communism as a movement has gotten beyond that. And if you look at the strength of communism in the 20th century, it's not when communists were going around destroying things. People don't remember the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution as a good time in Russia. When they were bombing the churches, when the country was barricaded, when they were being starved out. People don't remember those as good years. And people don't remember the Cultural Revolution as good years in China. The people who love communism and still admire Stalin, they admire Stalin because Stalin brought the people together and put them to work to go out and build and construct and to care for each other and to love each other and to build. That's what they remember about communism. In Cuba, people don't remember Fidel Castro coming to power and executing lots of people from the old regime and stadiums full of people cheering as the old regime is executed. People don't remember those as good years. The people who love Fidel Castro love him for building a healthcare system. They love him for paving the roads and teaching literacy. And they love him for the good things he did to bring people together. They love Fidel Castro for the Christian aspect of what he did, not for the libidinal release, the destructive aspect of what he did. And the strength of socialism around the world is its ability to construct and to build community and to bring people together. And the left, the libidinal release, that energy that comes out of the French Revolution that says, burn it down, tear it down, that gives people permission to be angry. You angry? You angry? You angry? You can be angry. Go tear something down. Go destroy. That wrecker energy, it's no longer in the hands of communists. That's in the hands of the imperialists. That's in the hands of George Soros. That's in the hands of Facebook and Twitter. They're the ones that have that wrecker energy. The left aesthetic is now the property of the imperialists. And the socialist countries of the world, in a way, you could argue that they're conservative because they offer stability to their population. They offer protection from the chaos and the turbulence of the market, from unemployment. The socialist countries of the world offer people a world where human beings matter, where people are not simply a mere financial calculation. And they offer a society where people feel an obligation to each other. They are standing up against the philosophical irrationalism that comes out of the West, which is really the logical conclusion of what called itself left. But communism has matured beyond that. Left was a stage communism had to go through. Because there was so much corruption that was there first, communism had to be left. It had to be destructive. It had to mobilize the peasantry against the landlords. That was necessary. But now the idols have been swept away. And now we can connect with the higher truth that was there. And now we can bring truth and justice back into the world. And socialism has matured beyond the left, while the dying, decaying old system does its best to hold on to what's left and use it to try and fend off the brave new world that's emerging. And those are my thoughts on the topic of faith and socialism, and I hope to hear a lot of interesting discussion after this. And I'm just part of this discussion. I'm not like the leader or anything. I just gave my presentation, but anyone who wants to speak can. I'm just one participant here. So
I just wanted to say I thought it was amazing that the left has been made an idol almost. Like in this movement, it feels like this idea that we don't want to give up the label of being associated with the left, right? Like we want to save it, like. But I think that is a huge. I realize we've made that into an idol, and it's become a huge waste of our time because it cuts us off from a lot of people that don't want to be associated with the idolatry of being associated with the left, if that makes sense.
I know one of the things that we talked about yesterday was being kind of an anti-monopoly coalition. And so I'm just wondering, if not like a libidinal energy to get rid of the monopolists or to move on to a higher stage, what is the energy that we should be harnessing and focusing on cultivating, both as broad social masses, but also as individuals?
Okay. Who else? Go ahead.
I mean, I have my suggestion for an answer. Yeah, building things.
So I got a few points I want to hit on, and that was excellent. I really like that. I think I've come to very similar conclusions from my own research. I'd like to point out slavery first. The ancient, very famous engineer from Greece, Archimedes, that guy was building primitive robots back in his day. And he would take this to the tyrants, as they were known then, said, look at this wonderful machinery, and look what this can do for our society. And you know what the tyrants did? They said, throw that away. We have slaves. We don't need that. So just think, and this is just one point, think of how far the slave trade throughout history of the entire world set us back, and how far into the future we would be if mankind never did that to his own brother and sister. And I want to lightly point to Christianity in Rome. I think you made 2 points, Caleb. That I would say that Christianity didn't coincide with the collapse of Rome per se. I think Rome was, as any empire, is bound to decline, and I think Christianity kind of saved Rome in a way, or it gave it a longer lifespan. There's a book by Yuval Harari called *Sapiens*. I recommend it, but I also recommend it with some caution because he's a transhumanist globalist and he's got some bad ideas in that book. But he does have some really good ones. He talks about the common mythology of societies, which you could have nationalism or religion. So Rome at that time was very much like we are today, a very hyper-individualistic society with no like real common bond. That old religion they had was fading away, and just like today, everybody is individualized, isolated, and by introducing Christianity into society, you now have this new mortar that they can repair their temple with, so to speak. So the structure stuck around for 600 more years. But it was doomed to decline, absolutely. So that I really like that that comparison. So yeah, you have the agricultural revolution brings in the origin of property, like you say. It is very much like the fall of man for me is it is the satanic spirit, right? It's the cultivation of materialism, and from that, you get the idols, right? So people build the idols. And like you said, they are symbols, and people understood them to be representative of higher ideals. But over time, those ideals fade into the background and become shadows, and people just focus on the idol, right? So that symbol becomes a tool of enslavement for the people. And those things do need to be smashed, so to speak, to reveal the underlying principles that was there. And Plato spoke about that. It's very, very similar to the allegory of the cave, right? So you have the people in the cave, and they're watching the shadows, and one man breaks free of the chains, and he goes out and he realizes that those are just shadows. Those aren't real things. And he goes back into the cave to reveal what he's learned, and what happens to him, right? He gets murdered, which is very much like the Messiah gets nailed to the cross or anything like that. So that the ruling class always has that initial way to put down or execute that revolutionary, But like you say, over time, and just like Rome, right? So they figure that they can co-opt those movements. And I think it's very wise to not make concessions with the imperialists, that whatever they offer you is a trick, you know? And the question Liam asked, like, what do we do, you know, instead of that libidinal energy, the energy we should have is like camaraderie, come together, peaceful revolution, you know, instead of that smashing, because what happens after that is just the same vicious circle. But yeah, that's it.
At the at the beginning of the class, you talked about how Nietzsche and his philosophy have kind of been adopted by the ruling class. I also believe that his philosophy has influenced the Nazis and fascists in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for starting a really interesting discussion, Caleb, and bringing up all these interesting points. Something I think about, of course, generally our primary concerns are economic, practical, the scientific rules of history. We see these as the primary driver, but primary does not mean only. It's important to think about culture, to think about these things that motivate people, not necessarily as our sole purpose, but something worth keeping in mind and as we relate to people. And I was thinking about the degradation from idols from symbolizing some, from the concept they represent to just the pure symbolism. And I was thinking about the way that everything that this movement, that communism and socialism have historically stood and fought for, has been taken and turned into idols. How the fight for black liberation and civil rights, how the fight for women's liberation and like women's rights and all these other struggles that have historically, been fought and won by the efforts of socialists and communists around the world have been taken and turned from a larger concept of the liberation of women as a whole, the liberation of black people as a whole, into an idol, into representation, into we don't need to liberate all women. We need one woman to be president. We don't need to liberate all black people. We need 250 of the Fortune 500 companies to have women CEOs, and we need 100 of those to be black CEOs. And as long as we just have the idols lined up properly, the rest of society doesn't matter. But I think about, would the early Christians have been satisfied with the fall of Rome? Because they wanted Christianity to spread and Rome to crumble. But is that all that they wanted? Because I think, the early Christians wanted Rome to crumble, to give way to a new Eden, to give way to that the last shall be first. And not after Rome fell, something Caleb has talked about before is that the population of Europe did not recover for over 1,000 years. As the libraries were burned, as everything descended into chaos. Yes, Christianity flourished, Christianity gained power, and Rome lost power. But the true goals were not fulfilled. And we can think about, as all these things we believe in are turned into idols, we are seeing a moment where the American empire is in decline, is crumbling, and we could clap and cheer as our idols rise ascendant and our people starve. But is that the true goal we want to fight for?
Well said.
Yeah.
It's a tough thing to follow because why it's not that important. I know it's kind of silly to fixate on labels or names, but would it be like what we're talking about is a post-left socialism?
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, I really like what you said because it appeals. You can turn people against their own best interests or what they know is the best thing to do by appealing to one of these idols. You know, like racial equality or women's rights or the trans issue. Or these are all super important, but you see it on social media. People will twist themselves in pretzels to not, what's the word, transgress one of the idols of the present liberal culture. And I know, at least for me, I find this return to tradition in the communist movement almost like part of the dialectic or the synthesis. Like you had feudalism, all spiritual idealism, and then you have the early Marxist movement, pure dialectical materialism. And I almost wonder if the synthesis back, like, does the dialectic stop with the philosophy? I would think not. It seems, is there a way to synthesize spirituality with dialectical materialism? That's where my head's at recently, and I'm very interested that the leaders of the modern movement, like, what's the leader of the Communist Party in Russia?
Gennady Zhuganov.
Right. So he's an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
He's raised there, knows the history inside and out. He's the leader of the party. He's an Orthodox Christian, even though when the early party went to war with the church.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested. I want to read his autobiography. I tried to find it on Amazon. It was like $200. Wow. But I want to study his mind and try to figure out how have you made peace with, because I want to make peace with it as well. And then you've got Xi in China, who seems to have made peace with Confucianism and synthesized the two for the Asian heart. And I don't know. That's where my brain's at presently, because the raw materialism seems to lead to nihilism, and that's what's so exciting about our group is I feel that we are kind of on the cutting edge of this synthesis of, true non-sellout Marxism and also the best aspects of the Christian spirit at work in a non-cynical United States culture. So I'm excited for what we're doing here.
That's great.
Dude, that is absolutely an amazing comment that you just made. And I think that actually what you're talking about, dialectical materialism is the synthesis itself, right? Some people talk about, like a little bit, at least I've heard, this idea that philosophy has almost represented, at least throughout history, as a broad trend of the ruling class, and then religion has been an expression of people's desires in one way or another. And both have been dominated by the ruling class to do various things. But what you're talking about, that vulgar, that raw materialism, Marx polemicized heavily against it. And that's where we get the dialectic from. Dialectic comes from the philosophy. It comes from the other side. So it's almost like the idol worship of dialectical materialism led back to pure, vulgar materialism.
Yes.
And people have forgotten the dialectic.
I love that even dialectical materialism has been made an idol in a way.
Either way, that's all I wanted to say. I really liked your comments, Tyler.
Thank you.
So that's interesting because I think that a lot of people who have talked about like liberation theology and stuff, they're like, they make the argument that communism is like almost like Christianity realized. And I think that there's a potential, though, in a strange sense, that the opposite may be true, that communism might make us realize true Christianity. And there is this Russian guy, his name was Fedorov. He was a Russian Orthodox guy. He ran like a library, and he is considered the founder of what's called the Cosmism, Russian Cosmism. he was actually like kind of excommunicated from the Orthodox Church because he had this very radical materialist view that it was actually through the development of technology and society that we would realize the revelation in the Bible. And he was really also really into like rocketry to a certain extent. And if you look at the timeline of the people influenced by him, modern rocketry kind of came through this guy and his concepts, but he had imagined that genetic engineering, as well as industrial developments and advances in the medical sciences, would lead us eventually to the ability to be able to resurrect humanity, which is what is predicted in the Bible, that everyone will resurrect and ascend to heaven. Well, he took a very literal and materialist interpretation of this, that we would be building society to where we can resurrect everyone and then colonize all of space and just create heaven. And so he took like a very materialist perspective of like what heaven is supposed to be, and for that reason he was considered almost maybe like the Antichrist or something by certain Orthodox folks. But I find it very inspiring and very interesting, this theory.
I feel in our own flawed way we're kind of, a church in a way. I don't. We're a gathering of believers in a persecuted culture, and every time I come to one of these events, it's just my spiritual life is refreshed. Just being around you guys and a community of believers, if you will, and we're figuring this out together. We're not all Christians, or not all. Some people are atheists, but it's just, I don't know. I feel I'm a believer, and I feel the Spirit work in here, and it's willing to drive across the country over and over just to be around you people. So I love it.
Lily,
comment?
First of all, thank you so much for this lecture, because I feel like with the modern world we're living in, we are pushed more and more to kind of bury our faith deeper inside and just practice it as a personal thing, and not even talking about it can be, a little bit stigma, and can be read into like you're enforcing something on someone, forcing your beliefs on someone. So I was getting into a point where I was kind of just burying it deep inside me and just as a personal thing. But it's I found it, even though you were not talking about my faith per se, but I found a lot of connection, and I kind of found it very inspiring. Another point that I kind of want to mention was you talked about the when Prophet Muhammad smashed the idols. Here's a very important point here was after smashing it, he didn't leave the people alone directionless, so they kind of just, not doing what to do. He replaced it with praying 5 times a day, and told the followers that you don't need something to connect you with the higher power. When you pray, you are directly connected to the higher power, and you do it 5 times a day, so you keep that connection and you don't lose it, and it doesn't become a routine thing. So I think this is the lesson for us to learn here, is as we try to kind of replace the current, smash down the current system, is to have a very concrete and good plan to, I think this is what we are doing here too, but just to remember that we need to have a replacement ready just to implement right away, so we don't have this chaotic, period that we saw during the history while, revolutions happen and new things kind of turn up. We have a replacement in the plan right away to kind of control the chaos.
You might go to a doctor who has a very good reason to cut a wound open again, to stitch it, to clean it and stitch it shut properly, to break a bone in order to set it and heal it properly. But it's important to remember that as necessary as it is to break the bone, there is no virtue in that alone.
I just want to thank you for telling me that story about smashing the idols and then replacing it, because I feel like that's just, it was just such a great addition. And in my own like personal life, I have this struggle, as in that I feel like we don't need idols, or we don't need like the institution per se of like the church or the Catholic Church or even all these different churches. Like, we have direct access to God just by praying. Like, he's always there. We don't need some sort of like third party to get in the way with us. But at the same time, having that connection with people around you with your relationship to God is so important. But it seems like once you start to make it a group thing, then dogmas and like a groupthink type attitude breaks in. And so it's almost like in the debates about communism, there's like the anarchist faction and the more like, like centralized control type people. And I almost feel like there's a similar type problem in religion, as in like, although the relationship to God is a very personal one, at the same time, you need a community to be able to fully express that. But then how do you balance out to make sure that people are still free and independent and conscious and thinking for themselves, but they actually have a real community connection?
I think this can be really like seen in the communal celebrations or gatherings. I think for Christians it's on Sundays, and for Muslims it's on Fridays, where you go to one institution and you gather and you pray together. I don't know I know for Islam, like if you pray in a line with a group of people, you get a lot more reward than if you pray alone. At the same time, there are a lot of personal prayers that you say just for yourself to have this connection. So I think the religion really does kind of emphasize the importance of community, the importance of connection, the importance of living with your being good to your neighbor, and like kind of going to the mosque and see that your neighbor is doing okay. If anyone needs help, you kind of help them. I think I see the connection here for me too.
Yeah, and it's like moving to a stateless, classless, borderless society, like under the current conditions. It's like we can't just do it overnight, and I feel it's like a similar thing in religion. Like, I feel like there is this desire, and there's like this new age movement that is pushing for like a universal religion, and there's this idea that all religions can get along, but at the same time there's also there's circumstances that still exist that make like a completely borderless, a completely like, that would really, if we enforce that right now, it would be completely authoritarian. And so it's like interesting.
Was a mistake,
I don't know know about that. Yeah. But yeah, we're evolving. It's interesting to see how religion is evolving at the same time.
Okay, hi. I think I have to jump in here too because, like Tyler mentioned, I do find like a spiritual connection in this room, And my name is Kieran, and I'm an alcoholic. Okay. I know this isn't that. Thank you. I know this isn't that meeting, but I was outside of an AA meeting back in 2010, and we were talking about politics, and a guy said to me, "Who are you voting for?" And I says, "I don't know. I just vote for whoever the union suggests, And he goes, "That's your problem. You don't think for yourself." So I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll show you." So I started like thinking for myself, and I looking at how the world works and this and that, and I started exploring socialism, and then got involved in all that and Occupy and everything. And after that, when it fizzled out, I was completely burnt out. I was had all these different ideas in my head, and I started drinking again, and by this time I was like spiritually bankrupt, to the point where when my daughter made her communion, I refused to go into church. I stood outside and devastated her, but I was like, I had all these different views, and I saw the Catholic Church as just this instrument of oppression and blah, 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 and so, time went on, and 2018, I almost had a near fatal overdose, right? Which I wound up going to rehab, and coming out of there, I got back in AA, and I actually did like the AA steps, and which actually originated from the Oxford group that you talk about. The tenets of the Oxford group were used by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob where they looked at them and made their own 12 steps out of that, and so there's a connection there, and when you get an AA coin, it actually says "To thine own self be true" on the back, which is
really
which was also discussed yesterday. So, but and actually doing the steps and having a spiritual awakening, as a result, I got closer to religion again, and to I don't go back to church, but I'm not hostile towards it, and I see that there's this connection there where. I see the parallels, of where we need to go and as you laid out there. And so with that, there's this other recent quote that I just found, and this is from a book by Nikolai Ostrovsky in the novel How Steel Was Tempered.
Yeah.
And I haven't read it, but it's actually like one of the most widely read books ever made. It's not in my local library, though, so as you can imagine, it's a Soviet book, right? He's a Soviet author, but he says, man's dearest possession is life. It is given to him but once, and he must live it so as to feel no torturing regrets for wasted years, never know the shame of a mean and petty past. So live that dying he might say, all my life, all my strength were given to the finest cause in all the world, the fight for the liberation of mankind. So, that's a pretty noble cause, and I've been drawn towards CPI and Caleb's talks, and Caleb is like my sponsor, I guess. He doesn't know that.
Thank you.
But so it's just great to be here, and I feel this spiritual connection in the work that we're doing.
So glad you're here.
Yeah.
You want to say something?
First of all, I think the food's showing up, so we're about to eat soon, but I'm really enjoying this discussion. Second off, thank you, Kieran, for sharing your story. I just wanted to kind of relate a little bit, too, because I also find myself not being putting myself away from religion, mostly off of the Richard Dawkins stuff. Just like you're an idiot if you believe this type of thing. It's really just like trying to make it think that you can't be an intellectual, you can't be smart if you believe in something. If you believe in something you can't necessarily explain, or you have to actually have someone else has to put a little bit of faith into something they don't understand, and they want to say that that's what makes it stupid. On the other hand of it too is I went to Catholic school for about a year. Could not stand it. And I remembered the biggest thing that frustrated me was that I remember no one knew the golden rule. No one was treating each other how you should be treated. And I think that was one of the aspects when I was a very young child that really had me passionate about Christianity, about Catholicism specifically. My girlfriend even, she grew up in the Baptist church, and she ended up leaving because of mostly institutional problems. And I think that this kind of new nihilism is really trying to take advantage of any of these hardships, which happen in any single kind of group you have in a community. These type of things are possibilities. They're true. People suffer from things all the time, but it does not. But what I didn't realize at the time when I was a child, when I was about 8 years old, I did not realize that my problem was with Christianity. It was with class society. It was the fact that I was in a place where I didn't really have any defenders, and no one wanted to stand up for me. And if it was, even if you had like four siblings in there, things could turn against you pretty easily.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to just touch on how it is a little harder. Well, not harder. I've been finding this to be a lot more embracing because it is taking the harder path of having to acknowledge that you are interacting with other individuals who don't think exactly what you do about spirituality. Yeah. And most of the time it's like how it was mentioned earlier. If you bring up some of these things, people will feel that, well, you're trying to push something, when even necessarily you might just be trying to relate or just trying to impart a little bit of wisdom that you may have found very, very useful. But much like this new nihilism kind of teaches, is that if they compel you at all, if they say a point that makes sense, that's not them getting to you, that's them manipulating you. And I was believing this crap for a long time just because of this new atheist movement too. But I still overall would probably consider myself to be non-religious. However, it's kind of hard to deny the presence of something bigger than yourself when you see all these people together. So, yeah. Yeah, so those are my thoughts there, folks.
Okay.
You know, you mentioned Richard Dawkins and the new atheists, and actually other people have mentioned the new atheists in this room. And as a fundamentalist, Bible-believing Christian, I actually like and respect the new atheists more than polite atheists, because the new atheists are at least gonna tell me that they think Christianity is stupid, and I can work with that. You know what I mean? But the polite atheist says, "Well, it's good for you. It's good for you. I'm sure it helps you, but it's not for me." That's a very condescending view that I do not appreciate. And this is edgy, but I've talked about how fundamentalist Christians and atheists need to come together and do kind of an Operation Mop-Up against liberal pro-imperialist churches. And I unironically believe that. Thank you. There is a lot of, we don't have time, I guess, for me to go through the whole plan of salvation right now, but, in the book of Acts, there's a man that says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And the early church, think about this. Here's a perfect opportunity for them to say, turn your whole life around and live like Jesus and do this and that. They say, what do they say? They say, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved." Caleb mentioned the Garden of Eden. The traditional Christian worldview, there's no such thing as a natural death. Death is not natural. We grow old because we're sinners. And that's part of the curse, from the beginning and from us. And, you can look up genetic entropy, how the human genome is degrading over time, and that points back to an original good creation. And there's a lot of stuff we don't have time to go into right now, I guess, because we're all getting hungry. Right. The book of Romans says, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And it also says, "For there is none righteous, no, not one." So to unquote, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect. It's intuitive in humanity that we need a savior, and we might not all agree on what that is, but I definitely, there's really no the idea that Jesus did not exist is actually really a fringe view. Very few historians believe it. Yeah. And there's really no dispute that Jesus claimed to be the only way. The question is whether he was correct or not, But anyway, so I just wanted to leave you guys with that. But let me also say, I just wanted to quote a poem that I have often quoted. It's actually a hymn. It's a hymn, but I'm not going to sing it. But I'm just going to the lyrics because it reminds me so much of communism this poem or this hymn actually popped into my head as a result of something that Elizabeth said months ago. But anyway, it's a hymn called Others, and the lyrics go, "Lord, help me live from day to day in such a self-forgetful way that even when I kneel to pray, my prayer shall be for others. Help me out in all I do to ever be sincere and true, and know that what I do for you must now be done for others. Let self be crucified and slain and buried deep and rise again, and may all efforts be in vain unless they be for others. And when my work on earth is done and my new life in heaven's begun, may I forget the crown I've won while thinking still of others. Others, Lord, yes, others. Let this my motto be. Help me live for others, that I may live like thee." There we go.
Yeah. So